Welcome back to KTN Weekend Prime. Tonight, like we promised, we're discussing a topic that has taken the world's attention in terms of the state and other actors dealing with members of the public in Kenya. We have our own tragic history with the subject of torture. The hashtag tonight is Ending Torture. And tonight in studio, we have the IMLU's Independent Medical Legal Unit Executive Director, Peter Kiama, with us to discuss the issue of ending torture. Of course, the day after the world commemorated the International Day Against Torture. Thanks for joining us again in studio, Peter. Last time we were here discussing a similar topic, who murdered Kwekwe, similar to the discussions that we're having now. And our first statistic is something that IMLU has been researching on for quite some time now. 60% of all reported cases of torture are reported to have been done by the police. Does this speak, is this a static trend that perhaps speaks to just one point in time, or is this a continuing trend?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me this evening. The statistics that you speak to are from our National Torture Prevention Survey 2011. But since then, the trend has been the same. Nothing much has changed. We are still seeing the police dominating, especially what we now call the Kenya Police Service, which is the boys and girls in blue. They're still leading in perpetrating cases of torture. And so we haven't seen much change, which is a disappointment because it's 4 years into the new into the Constitution of Kenya 2010, and about 3 years into the new National Police Service Act, which actually prohibits torture and provides for 25 years for torture for any officer found guilty, and 15 years for ill treatment.
Let's speak about the demographics within this statistic as well. Not everybody experiences torture when they interact with the police. According to the research that you've seen, which demographic, which groups of people are most vulnerable to torture, especially by the police?
According to our casework for the last 4 years, the majority of victims of people who interact with the police in a very traumatizing way are the poor, the young and poor, or the young and unemployed. Those who do not have access to socioeconomic activities, for example, formal employment, or even people who have no means of starting a meaningful business. Those are the people between the age of 18 and early 30s. Young men who are looking forward to starting a family, settling down, getting a job. Those are the ones. And they are at a stage where they are very, very vulnerable. We are talking about the hawkers. We are talking about petty traders who are saying, we've made a choice. We don't want to go into crime. We want to make a living, but yet there's no chance given to them.
Is it just the police, or are there other state agents that are targeting and focusing on these groups?
The main ones are the police in the process of law enforcement. Between the time you are stopped, searched, put in detention, or taken to court, that's the time when this mainly happens. The other ones who are catching up very, very fast are the City Council of Nairobi law enforcement officers, who we call the Askaris. And they've actually gone to a very extreme situation where they're even stabbing hookers.
We actually ran a
enforcement.
We ran a report on the same. I think it was called
the other ones who are catching up very fast is the Kenya Wildlife Service Rangers, especially in Isiolo, in Kina sub-county, and Kajiado towards Oloitoktok. In terms of enforcing the laws, the wildlife service laws, they are getting to this habit of also torture, but also, very sad, enforced disappearances. We are now investigating 17 cases of people who are said to have been taken away by Kenya Wildlife Service Rangers in Isiolo, and they've not been seen since then.
So if this permeates almost every as part of our discipline forces, then the question remains, how then do we change it? We've got IPOA, we've got the NPSC, these constitutional bodies and statutory bodies that are supposed to be oversighting the police with respect to their work, specifically with the crimes that are committed within the police force. Are they doing their work correctly?
Unfortunately, the much hyped police reforms have collapsed. I would say so. Very, very unfortunate. If you look at it, for example, we have now over 200 officers having been vetted between 2013 and now.
Yeah.
None of them has been held accountable for human rights violations and especially torture. And we do know some of them who have been, accused of having been in charge of, teams, of police teams
Yes.
that perpetrated torture or ill treatment. None of them has been found guilty or found unsuitable on the account of torture or ill treatment.
All right, but the Kavuludi Commission would say then that that's on the basis of the evidence that's presented with respect to the officers, the officers' actions while they were in office in specific offices. Has IMLU, based on the kind of evidence that they've been able to present over time, presented evidence specifically about specific officers?
Yes, we have. We have actually, since 2013, submitted information of over 50 officers.
And what's happened with them?
But we haven't seen enough scrutiny because our capacity to investigate is limited. We are not investigators, but we do our best to collect all the information we can manage. We do expect that the commission then will go beyond civilian investigations to conduct. They have the capacity to investigate, to go beyond that and go behind the scenes and get the evidence, get the witnesses, and take their time on those cases.
All right. On our board right now, we have two kinds of torture: forceful evictions, extrajudicial executions. What you spoke about fairly recently, and that specifically is linked quite closely to fighting terrorism in the country and other forms of violent crime within the country. The police have often spoken about their frustration with the legal process in not being able to put behind bars some of the people that are taken to court. Do you think this is a truism, or there is some truth in this kind of a defense where, although it's not official, that reliance on extrajudicial executions and forced evictions becomes a necessity in the kind of war that we're facing now?
I'll tell you what has happened is that the police have two main choices: to use force or to use intelligence. They opt for the first choice of using force. Now that is not sustainable, as we have seen, because you use force against civilians, they turn against you. You actually become a target. If you look at the last 4, 5, 6 years, we have had more police officers being attacked in broad daylight by citizens than we have ever seen since independence. Basically because the police themselves, in using force in law enforcement, have actually legitimized violence. And therefore, they are also citizens of this country. So we have been having conversations with the police saying, please stop using unnecessary force, unnecessary violence, because you are telling citizens that, yes, using force is the way to go.
Speaking of which, citizens also have a role in torture. Aside from the state and the police specifically in perpetrating torture, there are other forms of torture that are perpetrated on a daily basis. Mob justice, for one. Remember the kind of psychological torture that those ladies who were walking in town underwent when they were stripped by Matatu touts, by members of the public. That's something that has happened in the public space for such a long time. Do you think that things like these have become normalized to the extent that we don't see them as torture?
What I want to clarify is that violence from any quarters is unacceptable, is unconstitutional, is illegal. And therefore, anybody who perpetrates violence against another in this country has committed a crime under the Penal Code. What we call mob justice, what I call mob injustice, actually is violence. And whoever perpetrates violence in the name of enforcing the law, whether it's a civilian or a government official or a police officer, should be held to account. Now, I want to clarify one thing, that when we talk about torture, we are talking about torture under the definition or drawn from the UN Convention Against Torture. That mainly defines torture as perpetrated by a state official or in the knowledge of a state official. If women are being stripped naked and humiliated in the streets of Nairobi with the police watching, then that would most likely amount to torture because it is being done in the knowledge of the government, and the government is not stopping it. But mainly we deal with torture as defined, even under our constitution and under the Police Service Act, as an act perpetrated with the intention of either forcing you to do something that you would not ordinarily do in normal circumstances. For example, confessing to something you never did, or being asked to name people who are suspects, who you might not even know, or you might not even discuss in normal circumstances. That is, would fall within the definition of torture.
Yeah.
Now, shootings,
yes.
Extrajudicial executions through shooting would amount to torture, because it leads to intimidation and a culture of fear. Now, strangulation that we are seeing nowadays in various police stations in this country, including Ongata Rongai, Gong police station,
yes.
Kabete police station, we are beginning to see cases of strangulation through using ropes against young men. So they are arrested, put in the back of a vehicle without number plates, and strangled as they are interrogated in a police car. That amounts to torture, and that should be punished under the National Police Service Act.
All right, these specific cases that you mentioned, and we have one specific case on our board right now that happened on the 4th of July, just a couple of days ago, a couple of weeks ago, with a police officer whipping people who are in custody. These kinds of cases, as clear-cut as this picture, for instance, the ones that you were talking about with respect to the strangulations, does IMLU have documentary evidence on the same, so that we're not just blanketly, placing a blanket on the police with respect to that kind of a crime?
We do have evidence, and we submitted this evidence to the Independent Policing Oversight Authority. They've been doing a very good job in terms of very positive response to us. Unlike before, where we would report to the head of CID in a particular station, or the OCPD, or we would report to Vigilance House, in many cases we would get no response at all.
Yeah.
Now we are getting responses from IPOA in a very proactive manner. Of course, things are not as fast as victims would like to see things happening, but at least we have seen a proactiveness on the side of IPOA.
All right,
so we do have evidence in some cases, and we provide that evidence to the state organs.
Okay, let's push forward to something that happened on the 26th of March this year. During the State of the Nation address, President Uhuru Kenyatta came out and did something unexpected, especially given the history that we have with respect to torture in this country. We have a clip of that from President Uhuru Kenyatta, Uhuru Kenyatta's speech on the 26th of March, where he spoke about restorative justice and issued this statement with respect to that.
Fellow Kenyans, the time has come to bring closure to this very painful past. The time has come to allow ourselves the full benefit of a cohesive, unified, and confident Kenya as we claim our future. My brothers and sisters, to move forward as one nation, I stand before you today on my own behalf, that of my government, and all past governments, to offer the sincere apology of the government of the Republic of Kenya to all our compatriots for all past wrongs.
All right, that being unprecedented, no president has been able to do that in our 52-year history. What do you make of that statement with respect to ending torture in the Republic of Kenya?
Of course, that to me was unexpected at that particular time, but it is most welcome because it provides a new beginning for the country. If only we were able then to see government officials across the board, within the police, within the judiciary, within the prosecution, within investigations, if we're able to begin seeing them taking up the challenge from the president, then we would see a huge difference.
All right.
If only the police took cue from that apology and say, fine, the president has indicated an intention to put a closure, for example, to torture and ill treatment. and we are going from this day to encourage ourselves to behave in a different manner, then we would see a difference. But I wonder whether any of the police officers we see perpetrating torture even today, ever listen to the president. If they had, maybe they had a different message.
That's fairly interesting, Peter, and I wish we could get into that, but we're close to time when we need to wind up. Just a couple of questions that I want to ask. 10 billion shillings for restorative justice spread across 3 years. How would you want it implemented? How would you want that money spent, rather?
Now, the 10 billion are the restorative justice fund. One, the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission identified 12,756 victims of torture, systematic torture over the years since independence, and 7,095 cases of unlawful detention. Now, since that documentation, I think we have another maybe 10,000 cases of unlawful detention. The number of young people who are illegally detained in police stations across the country, especially in the poorer areas of Nairobi and rural areas, are massive every day. So our recommendation is one, that we ensure that all those who have been working and walking along with victims of torture and ill treatment over the years are involved. Civil society organizations who have the medical expertise, who have the psychological expertise, who have the social work skills to be able to support victims to access the fund. The victims themselves, the state has an obligation to organize the victims around this fund, so that only those who are deserving get access to it. And now, we do know that most of the 12,000 plus others will never get justice in court, because maybe the perpetrators are not known, for example, in many cases.
For instance, with the post-election violence.
Exactly. So we are saying, even where the perpetrator is not known, even where the perpetrator is not taken to court, we as Kenyans owe victims rehabilitation, medical rehabilitation, psychological rehabilitation, and socio-economic rehabilitation, so that we restore them to their normal situation and they can move on with life as happy citizens who feel that who feel proud of this country.
All right, Peter, one last question, and we need to answer this in about 30 seconds before we move on. The coroner's protection, the coroner's bill, the Attorney General mentioned to you yesterday that it is now going to go before the House. How much of a game changer is the coroner's bill in 30 seconds, Peter?
The coroner's National Coroner Service Bill will be a game changer in this country with regard to beginning to see a clearly systematized system of death investigations. There are too many Kenyans who have never put closure to the death of their relatives because they've never known what happened to them, why they died, and how they died. Now, that is traumatic enough. So the National Coroner's Bill is going to set up an office that is solely in charge of professional investigation of death, a body that does not do law enforcement like the police, and therefore won't be tempted to hide the truth or to compromise the evidence being collected.
All right.
And I'm happy that the Attorney General came to our celebration on yesterday on the UN Day Against Torture, and actually committed that the two bills, then the Prevention of Torture Bill and the National Coroner Service Bill, are before Cabinet. That was the best news this year that we have received with victims of torture.
Okay, thank you. That's where we'll have to end it, Peter. Thank you very much for joining us again on KTN Weekend Prime. Of course, this is a subject that we've been talking about for the past 52 years, with various cases of torture having been recorded by the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission. And as Peter mentioned, cases of torture continue to occur. How do we end torture in our republic? How do we move forward with respect to that? Bringing down the numbers, those shameful numbers with respect to the police and in terms of torture, and turning those around to be able to make police a part and parcel of a solution in policing this country and being able to make this country safer. Lots of points that we discussed and went over this evening. And Yvonne Okwara has been listening to this discussion and now joins us for a brief summation of what we've been discussing on What's the Point. Yvonne.
Over 12,000 people documented in the TJRC report as having experienced torture. Now, the interesting thing about torture is it doesn't just affect the person who was tortured, it affects family and therefore society as a whole. So what's the point of our discussion tonight? For the past 52 years, and indeed even during colonial times, the state has always been involved in torture, whatever the nature of the state is. Remember, the colonial, our former colonial masters, Britain, indeed, had a mea culpa and said there was torture in the country, and we do know of what's happening with the Mau Mau victims who are now being compensated for torture that was done there. But it went right from the colonial masters to the current government that we have now. And what are some of the solutions towards ending torture that's perpetrated by state actors? It's fairly simple. Adhering to the law. That is all it takes. As our guest tonight has said, torture is indeed unacceptable and it is illegal, whether done by state actors or others. 60% of torture cases perpetrated by police officers in the country. That is a shocking statistic that needs to come down. It's simple as adhering to the law. Secondly, this is something that has come up even with your feedback on social media. Torture breeds bitterness and tends to alienate the very state actors who are hoping to gain the trust of the common citizens. Discontent leads to lack of respect for authority and therefore undermines the police itself. Abu Salman on Twitter says, half a century of police brutality and the resulting fear is impeding intelligence gathering to tackle terrorists and terrorism in the country. So you can see how this has a cycle effect. Finally, 60%, like we said, of torture is perpetrated by police officers. What about you? Let's look inward for a moment. The state isn't the only agent of torture. Think of a situation where you are employing an underage girl in your home and you're denying her food and indeed access to education. Does that count as torture? I should think so. Think about all those people who are locked up in public hospitals for lack of funds to pay off their bills. Is that torture? It counts as torture. And finally, when you decide to take justice in your own hands, mob justice, is that torture? It definitely counts. So what is your role in ending torture perpetrated by ordinary citizens like you and I? Think about that as we have our discussion tonight, because that is the point.